This is Dan Schneider, and this is the fourth Dan Schneider video interview. Actually, it's more of a conversation, and the two gentlemen that you see on your screen are related to the Prisoner Appreciation Society, Six of One, in the United Kingdom. On the left, you'll see Dave Barry, on the right, Max Hora, and we will be talking about the life and career of the actor Patrick McGoohan and his television career with shows such as The Prisoner and Danger Man. All right, I'm here with Dave Barry and Max Hora of Six of One, the Prisoner Appreciation Society, and we will be talking about the man behind The Prisoner and Danger Man, two of 1960s era great television series. So welcome first to both Max and to Dave.
Very nice to meet you, Dan,
Nice to see you, Dan.
and you
Okay,
also, viewers.
and let's talk about who Patrick McGoohan was at first. Most of the people who will be watching this will probably never have heard of Patrick McGoohan. He was a big star half a century ago. So if either one of you want to jump in and just give us a little bit of background, we'll go more in depth a little bit later, but just to let us know who McGoohan was.
Well, Patrick McGoohan, back in the early 60s, came to my attention and also the British public's attention when he starred in a spy series called Danger Man. It was very sharply written, it was fast moving. What was different about it as well was that he never used a gun and he didn't get the leading lady because he didn't want to do that sort of thing. So it was very plot intensive. Very rapidly, McGoohan became extremely popular, and Danger Man was a program that you rushed home to watch. Later on in the US, it was screened as Secret Agent.
And how about The Prisoner? That was sort of the follow-up series to that.
Yeah, of course, at the time, because Danger Man was so popular and it was a big hit in the States as well, McGoohan became the highest paid actor in the UK. And Lou Grade, who he worked for, who did a whole range of TV series, he went to Lou and he said, I don't want to make any more Danger Mans, but I've got this idea about a TV series. And Lou said, tell me about it. And at the time, David Jansen was starring in a TV series in the States called The Fugitive. And Patrick said, well, it's about this guy who's kidnapped and he wakes up in a mysterious village and is always trying to escape. And it's going to be called The Prisoner. And Lou said, yeah, that sounds pretty good. They shook their hands and the deal went ahead. A lot of the series at that time was in Patrick McGoohan's head. And the British public, of course, thought they were going to get a follow-up Danger Man, but they didn't. They got something totally different. They got something that encouraged them to think and question what they were being shown.
Yeah, The Prisoner, to me, and I've written about it, I think it's, in my opinion, the best work of art in television, at least in the English language in the UK, Australia, Canada, the US, that I've ever seen. And I think one of the reasons is because it is pretty short. It's only 17 episodes. And I think Danger Man was the best of the 1960s spy series. I recently rewatched it on video. Let's briefly talk then about what the Six of One Prisoner Appreciation Society is, when and why it was founded, if either one of you want to take that.
Okay, well, perhaps I'll step in on this. Um, I watched the series like many other people did when it first came out, and television, of course, then was ephemeral. You saw it, it went, and that was it. There were no recording devices. So we used to talk about it. We used to meet and say, do you remember that wonderful series, The Prisoner? Yeah, wasn't it great? And that was about it. In 1976, they happened to be rescreening it late on a Saturday night in the area that I lived at the time, the Midlands here in the UK. And I didn't buy a TV listings magazine, so I stumbled across it quite by accident. And each week, the continuity announcer said that they'd had various people write in saying what they thought it was all about because the TV company was encouraging that. Well, I didn't discover this until towards the end of the transmission. So I wrote to the TV company and said, I'd really like to meet some of these people who are corresponding with you. Can you put me in touch with them? They got back to me and said, we can't do that, but would you be happy for your name and address to be screened after the last episode? I said, sure, okay. So it was at midnight on the 12th of December 1976. My name and address was screened out to the Midlands area. And I thought, that's great. I wonder what's going to happen, because I envisaged perhaps meeting half a dozen people and having a chat about it in a pub. The outcome actually was very, very different, because 2 hours later, people started knocking at my door at 2:30 in the morning. I was out on the Sunday, and when I got home, lots of notes were shoved through the door, and then the mail started arriving, and within 2 weeks, I had somewhere about 500 letters. Having got this lot, I thought we'd better do something about it. Unfortunately, there were two keen enthusiasts who lived in Cheltenham, where I live, a chap called Roger Goodman and a lady called Judy Adamson, and they were as keen and enthusiastic as I was. So they beat a path to my door, and together we decided to start a society, and that's how it began.
And is this sort of like other conventions? Because I know you guys, you do run the convention that meets at Port Merion, where most of the externals of the Prisoner series was filmed, correct? So this also sprung out of 6 of 1?
Oh, yes, yes. It was very much thinking on our feet. If there was any other appreciation society for any other TV series, we didn't know about it. So we were really feeling our way in the dark. And fortunately, there was a very good press officer at Port Merion who, when we got in touch with her and said that we had this burgeoning society and hundreds of members, we agreed with her that we could come up and have a one-day convention. That was in April 1977, and the conventions grew out of that. They rapidly became weekends and then even bigger than that. So it was very helpful that Port Merion responded positively in the first place. It was also very, very fortunate that ITC, Lou Grade's company, also responded positively to us and invited us down to meet them. And I remember going down with Judy and Roger for a meeting at 7 o'clock at their headquarters. And David Withers, who was Lou Grade's PA, said to us, okay, how many members do you think you're going to get? And I plucked a figure out of the air of 3,000. And I just dreamt it up on the spot. And actually, within the first couple of years, that target was achieved. So we have to thank ITC enormously for encouraging us, giving us backing, letting us borrow episodes on celluloid to show at the conventions.
Well, we'll get more into the history of 6 of 1 a little bit later in the interview. Let's wrap this section up, and in our next segment, let's talk about Patrick McGoohan, the man, and his life before he became famous, basically his biography. And we'll do that in just a moment. Okay, back with Dave and Max, and in this segment I want to talk about who Patrick McGoohan was, where he came from, and I'm going to turn to Max for this. I know there was an episode, I forget which one, in The Prisoner, wherein the character played by McGoohan, number 6, it might have been the first or second episode, gives his birth date. I think it's March something of 1928, and that is McGoohan's birthday. So tell us a little bit about who Patrick McGoohan was, where he came from, and how he got into acting.
Right, well, Patrick McGoohan, yes, in the episode Arrival, the first Prisoner episode, he tells number 2 that Patrick McGoohan, was born at 4:31 a.m. 19th of March 1928, which is McGoohan's actual birthday. Um, and basically, he got into acting. I think his very first job in acting, I think he was simply walking across a stage carrying a bucket of coal. I think that was his first job. I think that's probably in Sheffield. He worked at the Sheffield Repertory Theatre for a while in the north of England. But later on, he was spotted, and he appeared in various films. One of them was Hell Drivers. I'm not sure if people who are watching this have seen the film Hell Drivers. It's got lots of very well-known actors in it, like Sean Connery, Sidney James, Stanley Baker, William Hartnell, all sorts of well-known actors in Hell Drivers. And then it was fairly soon after that Lou Grade put him into this series called Danger Man. I'd also like to mention at this point about McGoohan in Danger Man and Portmeirion, because of course that's a very important part of how The Prisoner came about. Patrick McGoohan filmed some of the early parts of Danger Man in Portmeirion. This was around 1959, 1960, around about that time. Some of the early episodes of Danger Man. There's one in particular called The View from the Villa, which has quite a lot of Portmeirion in it. And that's how Patrick McGoohan got together with Sir Clough Williams-Ellis, who created Portmeirion. Clough Williams-Ellis was the designer and the creator of the village of Portmeirion in North Wales. McGoohan met Clough Williams-Ellis when he was filming Danger Man, and it was 6 or 7 years later, when The Prisoner came to be filmed, that McGoohan thought, well, Portmeirion is the obvious place to film The Prisoner, because he discovered it 6 or 7 years earlier in Danger Man, and he thought this is the ideal place, a place of isolation where you wouldn't necessarily know where you are because of the unusual architecture. You wake up in Portmeirion and you just wouldn't know where in the world you were. So I think it's important to mention how McGoohan and Williams-Ellis got together, and McGoohan then decided to film The Prisoner in Portmeirion.
Yeah, View from the Villa was, at least in my DVD set of Danger Man, the first, I believe it was the pilot episode of Danger Man. But let's backtrack just a little bit more. I know that McGoohan was born, I think, in Brooklyn, New York, in the States. Was he an American citizen? And then his family moved. His parents were originally from Britain, I believe, but came and lived for a few years in America, and then they moved back, sort of like the Irish writer Frank McCourt, I believe.
Well, it's a bit complicated actually. Yes, he was born in, I believe, Astoria, Queens, New York, in 1928. Now, his parents had emigrated from the Republic of Ireland to New York, and McGoohan was born there, yes, in 1928, and he is an American citizen. But soon after he was born, quite soon after he was born, his parents took him back to Ireland, to, I believe it was County Leitrim in the Republic of Ireland. And then when he was about 7 years old, I think it was, they then moved to England in the UK, to the Sheffield area. I mentioned earlier about him starting acting in Sheffield. He had various jobs after leaving school. I think he went to Ratcliffe College in Leicestershire, that was his school. And then in Sheffield, he had various jobs. I think one was in a wire rope factory. I think he was a chicken farmer for a short while before he got into the acting business. So basically, it's New York, Republic of Ireland, England. That's sort of how it worked.
Well, did he start out as a stage actor? Did he start out in school? Or was he a professional all the way?
Well, I think, as I say, he had these various jobs before acting. I'm not quite sure exactly how the acting thing started. As I say, his first job, I think he got this job at Sheffield Repertory Theatre. He might have been in the prop department or something. He got a job at Sheffield Repertory Theatre doing something. And then I think, as I say, they got him into acting with that very first thing about walking across the stage carrying a bucket of coal, and it all sort of started from there. But he had 2 or 3 different jobs before he actually started at the theatre.
Yeah, and quite famously, I know he was like I believe very Roman Catholic, and he quite famously objected to excess violence in both of the series, and also gratuitous sexual innuendo and whatnot. Can you tell us a little bit about that background? Where that came from in his youth?
Well, yeah, and of course, at one stage, I believe he was actually considering becoming a Roman Catholic priest. I mean, that was a thought in his mind at some point in his youth.
Yeah.
He might become a priest, but of course that didn't happen. But yes, he did have a strong Catholic upbringing. And I think that's one of the reasons he turned down the role of James Bond, because he was offered the role of James Bond. But of course, James Bond is all for the guns and kissing girls, and I
Yeah.
don't think he's keen on that at all. So he rejected the idea of being James Bond. But Danger Man suited him well, and I think he adapted the character of John Drake in Danger Man to suit him. You know, he made John Drake a person who doesn't use guns and doesn't go around kissing girls all the time. He very much adapted the character to the way he wanted to play it.
So
He was
is
a man.
yeah.
He was a man of very strong principles. In some ways, unbending. His principles were more important to him than money, and he held on really to that philosophy for all of his life.
Yeah, and just to get back to the Bond thing, because that's something that's one of the sort of legends about him. I know, I've watched some of the James Bond film with commentaries and whatnot, and I've looked it up, and people have different accounts. Do you know if he was the first choice before Connery? Because
Yeah,
I've
he
read
was.
he was, because I've read too
He
that
was.
Roger Moore was, and then Moore was doing The Saint and couldn't do it, but McGoohan was even the first choice before Roger Moore. Is that correct?
Would you know about that?
Well, yeah, I think yes, he was the first person to be offered James Bond and he rejected it. And then I think later on, yes, I think he was offered the Saint, but he rejected that, and so that became Roger Moore as the Saint. But yes, Lou Grade chose him for Danger Man, and that was ideal for him. And as I say, once he'd been given the role, he made changes so that it suited the way he wanted to play it.
He was the one who actually recommended Sean Connery for the role of Bond.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So people like Moore and Connery and McGoohan, these were people that all worked in British television at the time. There was sort of a camaraderie.
Yes, I guess loosely. Would you say that
Yes,
was
I
true?
mean, obviously
Yeah.
they probably would all have known each other. They were all around at the same time. Yeah. But also, I'd like to say this business about John Drake in Danger Man. You know, in James Bond, when there's this well-known quotation about "My name is Bond, James Bond." You know, that
Yeah.
occurs a lot in the Bond. But of course, that's later on because James Bond started around 1962. In 1959, 1960, when they were making Danger Man, in other words, before James Bond, it was "My name is Drake, John Drake," because he actually
Yeah.
says that in the opening sequence. So
Yeah.
this business of Bond actually came after Drake. "My name is Drake, John Drake," and then later on, 2 or 3 years later, it was "My name is Bond, James Bond," says Sean Connery. But Patrick McGoohan got there first.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into the Danger Man series in our next segment. So let's then talk a little bit. We heard from Dave a little bit about how he had gotten into The Prisoner. Let me just ask Dave: were you a fan of McGoohan before The Prisoner? Had you been a fan of Danger Man?
I hadn't come across McGoohan until Danger Man, and Danger Man had me hooked the way it had the whole British population hooked,
Yeah.
because it was a very superior program. And McGoohan's got this ability to play a character with great intensity. And when he's on screen, he's magnetic. You watch him, he radiates this charisma in spades. And every week we all watched Danger Man and then we discussed it the following day at work. It was a really popular TV program. But I hadn't come across him before then. But I was alerted, having seen him then, to go and see films that he did, like Dr. Sin, The Scarecrow, and of course, Hell Drivers, because you thought, wow, this man's really got something. It's not surprising that at the time he was such a hugely paid star.
Yeah. And how about you, Max? Were you a Danger Man fan and then found The Prisoner, or what?
Yes. Well, what happened was my family got a television set for the first time in about 1963 when I was 8 years old.
Uh-huh.
And there was a particular slot on a Sunday evening at 7:25 p.m., which usually had a rather interesting drama. For example, The Saints was sometimes in that slot. There was an American series called 77 Sunset Strip, which I think was starring Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. That was in that slot sometimes. And then at some point there was Danger Man in that slot on a Sunday evening. So I started watching Danger Man in about 63 when we got that television. And I watched virtually all the Danger Mans that I could until 67. and that slot was then used in '67 for The Prisoner, 7:25 on a Sunday evening.
Yeah, and I recall when I was doing an essay or my review of the Danger Man series that actually the last two episodes I think of Danger Man didn't air until after The Prisoner started airing. They had been filmed about a year before but hadn't hit the screen. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
There were two episodes at the end of
The
Danger
color
Man,
ones.
made in color, yeah,
Yeah.
Kuroshi and Shindashima. Those were two color episodes, the only two color episodes of Danger Man. And yes, in some screenings, I think they were actually delayed and put on around the same time as The Prisoner, because the final episode of The Prisoner was made right at the end in a hurry. And I think at some point it might not have been ready or something. So, yes, those Danger Man episodes, those color ones, were sort of held back for a while. But Fallout, yes, the final Prisoner episode was very much made at the last minute in a hurry right at the end.
And let's just end this segment by asking: either of you do what do you guys do for a living? Are you in the TV industry yourself or not?
Well, I used to be a
Uh-huh.
professional wine taster,
Ah, okay.
but there was something that was much closer to my heart, and that was I've always been interested in the idea of whole foods and nutrition. So I went into my first health food store in the early 1960s, and in 1980 I got the opportunity to get a job in the health food trade. So I worked for a company that manufactures nutritional supplements. In the 1960s, if you kind of thought this way into healthy food and remember the term organic hadn't even been invented, you were considered a crank. But always remember that a crank is a small thing that gets bigger things going. So I like to think in some way that I've been proud to be a crank. And of course, the whole world now is catching up with the whole idea, particularly in the States, of things like organic, vitamins and minerals, and all that sort of thing. So I feel I've been very lucky to do two careers in things that I both love.
And how about you, How about you, Max? Are you
Yes,
into the
well,
TV?
yeah, well, my first job was working in a department store in Reading, which is my hometown in Berkshire in England. And then later on, I got a job driving vans, and I used to deliver things in my van. And then I moved to Cheltenham because 6 of 1, the Prisoner Society, was run from Cheltenham. I moved to Cheltenham in 1979, and I got a little job in a restaurant to start with. And then later on, I started driving vans in Cheltenham.
Ah.
And then later on in 1982, as I mentioned earlier, I started the Prisoner shop in Portmere and ran that full time for 16 years. And then when I gave that up, I started an interest in classic cars, which I'm still doing. I'm very much into old cars from the 1960s and 1970s. That's my favourite era. So I now sort of work on classic cars most of the time.
And you mentioned the Prisoner shop. Was that a full-time shop where you sold like trinkets and memorabilia from the series?
That's correct, yes. And as well as selling things, it was also an information centre as well, you see, because a lot of people who go to Portmare, probably about half the people who go to Portmare and go there because they've seen The Prisoner.
Yeah.
So I was able to help them with any inquiries that they may have, and I sold things as well as answering questions about The Prisoner. So that was my full-time job for 16 years. The shop is still there. It's now run by Portmeirion themselves. The Portmeirion management now run the shop themselves, but I ran it as sort of my own little business for 16 years, yeah.
It's also worth adding that the Prisoner shop is actually located in number six's house. So if any of the people viewing this go to Portmeirion, if they make for number six's house, they'll find the Prisoner shop.
Ah. Okay, let us end this segment. When we get back, we will talk specifically about Danger Man and the rise to fame of Patrick McGoohan. And I am back with Dave Barry and Max Hora of 601, the Prisoner Appreciation Society. In this segment, we will not be talking about the prisoner, however. We'll be talking about Patrick McGoohan's first brush with fame and his first television series, Danger Man, which was better known in the U.S. as Secret Agent. So how did Danger Man get started? We touched a little bit about it earlier. Lou Grade headed a company called ITC, and he, I guess, wanted to. Well, this was before Bond, so let's talk a little bit of how that series got started and what precipitated McGoohan's rise to fame.
You want to start?
No, you start on that.
Me start. Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. At that time, there were only two TV channels. You either watched BBC, which tended to be a bit highbrow, or you watched ITV, as it was called. And on ITV, Lou Grade's programs aired, and he made a very popular series with Richard Green called The Adventures of Robin Hood. It was very big at the time. And various other series came along with historical figures like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Lancelot, and all that sort of thing. And then, so you knew you were going to get a quality product. And along came Patrick McGoohan in Danger Man, and it had us all hooked from the word go. Now remember, you only had two choices, BBC or ITV. So people were going to watch, a lot of people, millions of people were going to watch. And what set Danger Man apart, I think, from many of the other programs were that McGoohan brought his principles to bear. You know, no guns, no gratuitous violence, no swearing, no canoodling and kissing with girls and getting the girl every week. It was straight down to business. The scripts were superior. I mean, you got throwaway lines like cynicism is the last refuge of the idealist. That was just a throwaway line. McGoohan's magnetic screen presence, they started off as half-hour episodes. They were fast-moving, fast-pacing, and they were very ingenious, tightly and well-scripted. What do you think, Max?
Well, absolutely, yeah. And also, of course, Patrick McGoohan was very much on his own, really. This was so different from everything else that was on television. I mean, I think he was unique in this business of a rather moral sort of secret agent. You know, most secret agents are rather, should we put it, casual, put it, promiscuous.
Yeah.
But
right.
McGoohan really stood out as the sort of the moral secret agent.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, I know in the first season was the half-hour episodes, and the thing that I found very interesting about it is there were more expository scenes that you got into the character than you do in modern dramas.
Oh, yeah.
Even a lot of modern dramas that aren't action shows, and you know, like you said, it was very fast moving and quick paced. But you always had a wrap up, and it out of the first, I think the first 39 episodes were 25 minutes, and there were maybe two or three that, you know, were mediocre, but other than that, they all were very interesting. I remember the one. There was one where he's handcuffed to a woman, and he has to kill someone, and he's reluctant to do it. And so you had all of these premises. In the first season, though, he was supposedly an agent for NATO, and
Yeah.
the rest of it, he was working for M9, which is a fictionalized version. I guess it's M5 in the UK. But one of the things I know that I found odd was in reading reviews is they say that he's American in the first series and British in the rest, but the only time I heard him say that he was American was when he was clearly putting on an act. So I don't think you really know what nationality Drake is.
Yeah, he seems to undergo a sort of change. As you say, for the first 39 half-hour Danger Man, he seems to be a NATO agent, yeah. And then later on, there were the 47-hour-long Danger Mans, and he seems to have changed from a NATO agent into presumably a British agent, as you say, working for M9. So he seems to undergo this change, and his accent does change from time to time throughout the series. But in a way, it's a bit like The Prisoner, which came later, of course, but it's all a bit of a mystery. I mean, in The Prisoner, you're never quite sure who's who and what's what in The Prisoner. And in Danger Man, again, he sort of seems to change from sort of NATO to British agent, but it doesn't really matter. The important thing is he's obviously somebody involved in secret undercover work, and I think that's the important point there. Yeah.
And there was yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'd just like to say two things to kind of add to this: the complexity and the deep layers that Danger Man, particularly the hour-long ones, had. First of all, you had he's used intelligence to get out of situations rather than the gun or violence, and so he would use wordplay very, very cleverly. And the second thing is that very often the endings were downbeat.
Yeah.
They were not necessarily happy endings. You didn't get that. And that was all part of the attraction. And McGoohan was able to use his clout, of course, the to polish the scripts. And the script writers rose to this challenge that they wanted something that was a bit deeper and didn't necessarily pander to audience expectation.
Yeah, there's also a sense throughout the Danger Man series, I think, of foreshadowing what comes in The Prisoner. And we'll talk about the big controversy later on of whether Drake is number six, but I know that there's a number of episodes of two or three in the first half hour ones, and then later on where Drake feels betrayed by his own side, and he questions, the moral equivalence of them versus us. And I think that's one of the things that sets the series apart from things like Mission Impossible or I Spy or The Saint even. What and you this was something that was probably designed from the get-go, and how big an influence did McGoohan have over the whole tenor of that series?
What would you say, Max?
Well, yeah, I think he was very much, as I said earlier, a person who would adapt things to his way of doing things. I mean, basically, that's what happened with The Prisoner later on. He wasn't just the star, he was executive producer of The Prisoner. He wrote some of them, he directed some of them. And I think with Danger Man, he was obviously very influential in the character and how the character behaved, what the character said, what the character did. I mean, Lou Grade was somebody who I think would give somebody a lot of leeway. Lou Grade would say, okay, this is the job, get on with it. Lou Grade wasn't somebody who would sort of interfere and say, you should do this, you should do that. Lou Grade would simply say, right, the money's in your account, off you go, get on with it.
I would agree entirely with that. Lou Grade was the best person that McGoohan could work for, because Lou Grade gave McGoohan latitude. McGoohan was able to come in, and being a man with the principles he had, he was able to mould Danger Man to what he wanted.
Yeah, and I know you had said about some of the endings being left ambiguous. That's one of the things too that I've always found disheartening about most art, most writing, most television or films of the last few decades, is that everything has to be explained. It's the lowest common denominator. And one of the things that you see in Danger Man is you get episodes that end, and the endings are often what would be 5 minutes from the end in most television shows. He'll capture the bad guy or something, but instead of that kind of ending today where you get the hero sort of back patting himself and laughing with his sidekick, it just sort of ends. And sometimes it ends and you don't know exactly what's going to happen, and you have to think, okay, this is what he's likely going to do, and it makes the audience think, and because the audience is thinking, it leaves a deeper impression in your mind.
Yes. You see, the great thing is that you can either put something on the TV that's moving wallpaper or candy floss or that sort of thing, which is why I don't watch much TV, because I want to watch something that's going to stimulate my mind, that is going to leave me wondering and thinking and questioning. That's what I want. The TV programs can be a wonderful tool for stimulating the brain, but right now I can't think of anything that's contemporary that I would choose to watch.
Yeah. And I know that it probably wasn't planned this way as the series went along, but there were a number of episodes that seemed to be precursors to what was going to go on in The Prisoner. The obvious one is the one. Let me
Colony
see.
3.
Colony 3, where
Yeah.
there's a British town that's sort of a faux British town in the middle of Russia. There's one one that's called "It's Up to the Lady," about a possible defector who's lured back to Britain, and then she's betrayed by Drake's bosses. There's there's a one of my favorite ones was whatever happened to George Forster
Oh yeah.
about this sociopath who becomes I guess I don't know if he's a lord or whatnot, but he becomes a real power broker in Britain, and he you see there the sort of the seeds of number six against the village, and him going up against guy. Then there's one, the ubiquitous Mr. Lovegrove, which is a dream episode. And then we mentioned the last two color episodes, and this is basically about him battling a cult, and then they go underground in Japan, and these guys, I mean, it's so much like Fallout in The Prisoner. So if you guys can talk about your own views about how some of these things prefigured and maybe influenced McGoohan in thinking about what was to come.
Yeah, well, my favourite episode of Danger Man is certainly Colony 3, because as you mentioned earlier, it's rather like the village in The Prisoner. You know, they actually call the place the village in that particular episode.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that that episode in particular very much influenced McGoohan. Colony 3 is certainly, I'd say, my favourite, and also the ubiquitous Mr. Lovegrove. That's a great one as well. Because, of course, in later Prisoner episodes, there are episodes which are all about dreams. You know, A, B, and C in The Prisoner about
Yeah.
dream, being in harmony in The Prisoner is about a dream. So yes, I'd certainly say Colony 3. What about you, Dave?
Well, I like the ubiquitous Mr. Lovegrove because you watch something and it's really surreal. You
Yeah.
know, you don't know what's happening, and that I find very, very gripping. It's all explained in the end, but you sit back and you think, actually, I found that really enjoyable, really well done, really off the wall. It was very, very good. For what it's worth as well, Dan, the character who played George Foster in Whatever Happened to George Foster was the British actor Bernard Lee, who of course starred in the James Bond films as M. That's just something on the side.
And
But
I think Desmond Llewellyn, who played Q later on in James Bond, was in Lovegrove as
was
cabbie
he was
or something.
he was the doorman, I
The
think, wasn't
doorman.
he?
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
As Max says, Colony 3, I mean, that was the precursor to The Prisoner. There's this village in the middle of Russia where they send their spies and everyone speaks English. It is a miniature version of an English village, and McGoohan has to penetrate it.
and
Um,
and it also I think it came I think the second season or series as you call it in Britain came I think after the release of From Russia with Love, and you get that fight scene in the train that's reminiscent of the scene between Bond and the Russian spy whose name I forget in From Russia with Love, although uh, the From Russia with Love one is more melodramatic, it's more drawn out and whatnot,
yeah,
whereas this one is more quick. And that's one of the things that always sticks with me in these two main shows that McGoohan is known for is that despite the surrealism and whatnot, there is. I mean, yes, there's the Hollywood thing of one punch often knocks a guy out, and that can't really happen except for a lucky punch. But there is a bit more realism in the way people react and the violence not needing to be so over the top with everything exploding.
yeah, yeah. I would certainly agree with that. When I see the James Bond film that you're referring to, you see, you've got a big budget, um, a much bigger budget than a TV series. And yeah, the early Bond films I thought were quite good before they went on a different path. Um, but you see, McGoohan, as I say, he would never have played Bond because he didn't want all these things as the obligatory happy ending and getting the girl and all that sort of stuff. The fight scene that occurs in Colony 3 on the train is over much, much quicker because, after all, they haven't got the budget for it.
Yeah.
But it does not detract at all because the tale is so tightly told and so well told that you get whisked along and the hour show seems though it's flown by in 15 minutes. Well plotted, well constructed, well written, well acted.
Yeah, let me just talk about the last two color episodes again. And what do you do you think that those were used? I mean, we we know people who have watched The Prisoner and know its sort of internal mythos know that a lot of people think that it was just sort of slapdash at the last minute. I think there's some YouTube videos where McGoohan or some of the other people claim that, but I think when you if you see Shindashima, I think which is very last one where they're going underground and he's taking the Japanese villagers into to root out this cult. I mean, that had to have been in McGoohan's mind. I mean, it's just it. I mean, it's more surreal in The Prisoner. It's more epic. It's more psychological. But I can't believe that was just coincidental. What do you guys think?
Well, I think actually it's slightly different from that because I think the original idea, certainly Lou Grade's idea, was that McGoohan was going to carry on doing Danger Man. You see, because Danger Man was a very successful series,
Yeah.
and I think they were simply going to switch from doing black and white Danger Mans to color Danger Man. So that's you got the two color Danger Mans, Kuroshi and Shindashima. But then all of a sudden, in 1966. McGoohan sort of announced to Lou Grade, I'm fed up with Danger Man. We've done enough of them. We've done 86 episodes, and I've got something else I want to do now. And of course, later on, we'll probably talk about how The Prisoner came about. But basically, I think Lou Grade was probably surprised when McGoohan wanted to stop Danger Man. But McGoohan was absolutely fed up with Danger Man. He thought, we've done enough of them. I've got this idea of something else. Let's do something else. So he then approached Lou Grade about the something else, which was The Prisoner. What do you think, Dave?
Towards the end of Danger Man, I mean, he was taking more and more control, and he was able to direct episodes, and he felt that it had played its course. I'm not so sure about the two color episodes that we're talking about. I mean, they are an enjoyable romp. Um, I don't find them as thoughtful or as thought provoking as some others.
Yeah.
Um, I've watched them again fairly recently, and they do hold up very well. Uh, but yeah, I I would go back to the black and white ones for a choice. If
Yeah.
you've got a specific question you'd like to ask me on the two colour ones, Dan, I'll see if I can answer it. But that's my general view.
Yeah, I agree. I think the two color ones was certainly more influenced by Bond. They had that kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
what is the one where Bond there's the fake volcano in Japan. I think that was the fourth Bond film. But yeah, so I think there was definitely influence there, and I my guess is that when these came out, which was supposed to be the beginning of the fourth season, I believe, or fourth series, that McGoohan probably said, "Look, this is just getting campy," and he wanted to do something deeper. That's what I would take from that. I just wanted to
Yeah,
talk
I would
about.
agree.
I want to talk two other things before we end this segment. The first is uh, I mentioned earlier how throughout the Danger Man show, it seemed that the character of John Drake was getting more disillusioned with the spy business and his own bosses, and uh, not seeing much of a difference between the West and the Eastern side. Do you think that that reflected more of McGoohan's political views, or do you think that was also possibly a reflection of his own dealings with sort of the empty suits that run the television business?
I think probably the former.
Yeah.
McGoohan was a thinker. He was a reader. He wanted to explore things. He was not your everyday person. He was highly intelligent, and I think he was all the time he was trying to push the envelope and make things better. He was a perfectionist, and this applied to just about every area of his life. So it's good because he's brought this dimension to Danger Man, where the character does become more world weary and more disillusioned. Underneath, you can tell he's still the idealist. But that sort of thing, it wasn't popular at the time. You wouldn't have expected that sort of approach from a leading man in a popular TV spy series. It brought this other character, this other element, this other facet, and that made it all very interesting. The other thing about Bond and Danger Man, of course, is all the gadgets, and I suspect we start seeing John Drake using gadgets, really, before we see Bond using gadgets, which became quite a thing in the later Bond films. But in Danger Man, he comes up with some very interesting gadgets, and gadgets are used instead of guns.
Yeah.
The other thing about Lovegrove, of course, is that in a way you can make a comparison, a parallel with the Wizard of Oz. The
Oh,
end.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, Max, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I certainly agree about the gadgets, yes, because as I mentioned earlier about Danger Man being before Bond, about the business of finance, great, great, all that. Yeah, certainly I agree about the gadgets. McGoohan was very much one for gadgets, and you also see that in The Prisoner. I remember talking to the property buyer, the prisoner property chap called Mickey O'Toole. And he said on The Prisoner, McGoohan was very much into gadgets. He was always looking for something new, something different, something which hadn't been seen before. He was very much sort of an innovator. He wanted something that wasn't in other shows, and he was always looking for something different. Yeah.
Yeah, two final episodes that I just wanted to mention from Danger Man that stuck out to me, and I just wanted to see if they stuck with you guys. One was called The Outcast, in which we have this giant man who kills his lover, and Drake is sent to bring him in. He's in the British military, and he's not all there. The guy, and at the end, Drake brings him to justice, but you get a sense of Drake feeling some kind of ethical lapse in himself for having to deceive the guy. And the last one I wanted to mention was one called Judgment Day, which I think represented in many ways the possibly could arguably be the worst episode in the series, because it got very preachy. It was very much like a Judgment at Nuremberg thing, where you had a Joseph Mengele stand-in and a bunch of Israeli terrorists that capture him. But it also was so well written that even though it got a little bit preachy, you got a real sense of Drake's ethics there. And did either of those episodes stand out with you guys, pro or con?
Most definitely. Most definitely. I remember them both. Now, remember, I'm watching them. I was at the time in my late teens. I'm sitting there with my mum and dad and my sister, and we're watching them. And we used to talk about them afterwards. And the first one that you mentioned, I can remember us discussing it and what it meant to us. And the one that the second Judgment Day, I can remember it now. I mean, I found that gripping television.
Mm-hmm.
I really did. It really struck home. It was very powerful. I remember it as though it was yesterday.
And how about you, Max?
Yeah, well, and I also think that shows the type of person McGoohan was. You see, he wanted people to talk about things afterwards, because with a lot of television, you watch it and that's it. You move on, right? But of course, with some of those Danger Man episodes, and particularly with The Prisoner, you don't just move on afterwards. You talk about it, you discuss it with other people, you write about it, and of course, in the case of Dave, you start a society for it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more that happens after the show with things like Danger Man and The Prisoner. You don't just move on, you start talking and discussing and starting societies.
Okay, well, we will move on to our next segment, and in that one, we'll get to the meat of the matter, and we'll talk about The Prisoner, which, as I have said, I think is probably the best example of television as art form that I've ever seen, at least in the English language, and we'll get to that next. All right, and now we will get on to the meat of the matter, and that is the show The Prisoner itself. I've said a couple of times I think it is the best example of television as an art form that I've ever seen. I would assume that the two gentlemen that you see would agree with me. But let's talk about the conception of the show. A little bit earlier, we had talked about how McGoohan was fed up basically with doing spy stuff, and I'm assuming he wanted to do something a little bit more in depth, a little more out there. So if either of you wants to get into how the mechanics of that worked, what he had planned, and there's also a fellow named George Markstein, who was one of the co-creators, who has bitterly disagreed over the years. I don't know if he's still alive, but bitterly disagreed with McGoohan over the concept of the series. So take it away.
Well, I'll make a start, and then I'll let Max chip in.
Okay.
Yeah, What happened was McGoohan was fed up with doing Danger Man. Lou Grade wanted to hold on to him because he was a hot property. Now, McGoohan, he made a TV documentary in 1984 that was only ever screened once. And he was interviewed, and he said, I always had this idea in my mind of the individual against bureaucracy, against establishment, against all of these things. The individual's rights are very important. And he said he'd had this since he was a small child. And the man, because McGoohan set up Everyman Films with the Danger Man producer, David Tomblin. And Tomblin said, McGoohan went to him one day and said, I've got the money to make that series we've always talked about. Well, I mentioned earlier about how he had a meeting. It was on a Saturday morning. He went in, saw Lou Grade, said, I don't want to make any more Danger Man, but I've got this idea for a series. I've got the setting, Port Merion, and Lou said, yeah, you've got carte blanche, go ahead and do it. So the creative men got the money to go and do something that's never been done before. They needed a script editor, and George Markstein had a background in intelligence. He knew what was going on in the world of spies. And here, the kind of the two men, there's a bit of difference here, because George Markstein said he knew of somewhere called Inverlair Lodge in Scotland, where spies who knew too much were sent to, because they had information in their heads that was priceless and that they needed to be kept away from everybody else. And so he got the idea, he said, of the prisoner from that. And he also said that with Danger Man ending, it would mean the end of everybody's jobs. So if there could be a follow-up series, everybody who worked on it, their jobs could be safe. So you've got these two people coming, Markstein and McGoohan, with different stories. Who knows what the truth is going to be? Max may be able to shed a bit of light on that.
Yeah, well, Patrick McGoohan, I would say, was the driving force behind The Prisoner. And as I said earlier, he was executive producer. But of course, George Markstein was very important. He was script editor for 13 of the 17 Prisoner episodes. He was also, of course, the man behind the desk that McGoohan resigns to in Arrival, when McGoohan storms into the office and slams the envelope down on the desk. He's actually handing in his resignation to George Markstein. Yeah. And of course, to see George Markstein a bit later on in the series, in the episode Many Have Returns, when McGoohan returns to London and George Markstein is there behind the desk again. But yes, George Markstein, he knew about this place that they mentioned in Scotland. And George Markstein also wrote a book called The Cooler, which is sort of, again, based on this strange place in Scotland where spies who knew too much were put, for their own safety and to sort of keep them away from everybody else. So I would say they were both very important parts of The Prisoner, Patrick McGoohan, George Markstein, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, Sir Clough Williams-Ellis, who created Fort Marion. Those three people are really the three key people towards the success of The Prisoner.
The fourth key person is Lou Grade, because he financed it.
Yes.
Yeah, and
I would agree with Max. You see, that although George may lay claim to a number of things, it was McGoohan who I think came up with the original premise, and it is certainly McGoohan that made the series what it was. You could say that one man wanted a spy series, the other one wanted an escape from a spy series. I mentioned earlier a chap called Roger Goodman, who really was instrumental, along with Judy and myself. We formed a triangle in the early days in forming the society and getting this society formalised and up and running from nothing. And Roger Goodman has actually written a book on George Markstein that is quite good, and I would really recommend.
And of course, George Markstein also wrote he co-wrote the first episode. Arrival is written by George Markstein and David Tomblin, who was the series producer. So again, George Markstein, very important. Certainly at the beginning of the series, he co-wrote the first episode with David Tomblin.
Now we'll get into a little bit later what we talked in the break about whether the two characters from the two series are the same. Markstein always claimed that number 6, which is the main character, the prisoner, was John Drake. but I want to get into the legal aspect. Now, was Mark Stein involved with Danger Man? Because I've read that the Danger Man, the fellow who came up with that concept, was not going to lease John Drake to be used, and thus what was initially a legal problem was turned around to become something used well in the series.
Ralph Smart
Yeah,
was the chap who really owned copyright to John Drake.
yeah,
And by making the character of the prisoner nameless and a number, you could legally sidestep anything that you might have to pay Ralph Smart.
right,
Now, George Markstein, of course, maintained that number 6, of course, was John Drake.
yeah,
McGoohan maintained that it wasn't.
yeah,
Um, you pays your money and you takes your choice. What would
yeah,
you say, Matt?
Yeah, and I mean that's quite right. But also, in a way, it does to me anyway. I'm speaking personally. To me, it doesn't really matter. I mean, number 6 in The Prisoner is obviously somebody who has had some sort of secret job.
right,
Now, whether he was called John Drake or not, to me, it doesn't really matter. He's
yeah,
obviously involved in something like the intelligence services. So to me, I'm not worried whether he's John Drake or not. And of course, in the episode Maniac Returns, he actually does give himself a name. He calls himself Peter Smith.
right.
When Mrs. Butterworth in London asks him what his name is,
Now I
are you a
know.
nameless exile? And he says, no, Smith, Peter Smith.
Yeah.
I
Now,
also think that number 6 seems to have a harder edge to him than does John Drake. It may just be because he's been imprisoned and wants to escape, but
yeah,
there is that difference in character.
yeah, and it's sort of extra diegetic in that it doesn't really matter, as Max said. But I do having watched the whole Danger Man series, you kind of see a development of the John Drake character where he's believable. There's a natural progression of cynicism and anger and rage at the man, the machine, whatever you want to call it, that seems to be in number 6. But one of the other major sort of controversies that's often talked about in The Prison is the order of the episodes. Now, I got a decade or so ago,
Yeah.
the Mega Pack, they call it here in the States, and some of them are rather easy. There's Arrival, and then there's the last 3 or 4 that are in obvious order. And originally, only 7 was supposed to be made, or that's what McGoohan wanted. And Grade said, no, we need to have at least another 10. So let's talk a little bit about the number of episodes and how you sort of see them in order.
Max has written a booklet on this, haven't you, Max?
Yeah, about 30 years ago now, I actually
Yeah.
had something called an episode running order debate where people wrote in to me and sort of suggested their own preferred running orders, you see, and I put my running order as well. But basically, it's fairly complicated. McGoohan, yeah, he originally had in mind a mini series of 7 episodes,
Yeah.
but that wasn't really enough for a series or a season. Lou Grade wanted more. I think in Britain at the time, things were normally made in batches of 13. You make 13, you make another 13, you make another 13. Basically, so I think certainly Lou Grade wanted 13. Now, at the end of 13 episodes, I think the original plan was to then make another 13. But in actual fact, I think because money was running out, or because McGoohan was getting tired, or something happened, and they only made another 4. That's how it ended up as 17. And of course, it was after 13 episodes that Mark Stein left. He was script editor for 13 episodes.
And let's also mention that McGoohan, after the end of the first 13, left to do Ice Station Zebra. That's why we have the one episode where we have another fellow, number 6's in a different body.
Yeah, we have this business that McGoohan was offered a part in Hollywood. He was offered this Station Zebra. So he had to disappear for quite a while in 1967 to make Ice Station Zebra. So he was away for several weeks. And of course, they went to one of the writers, a chap called Vincent Tilsley, who had earlier on written the episode called The Chimes of Big Ben. And they said to Vincent Tilsley, we need you to write an episode which is not set in Port Marion and which doesn't have Patrick McGoohan in it very much.
Yeah.
So he came up with this idea that you had this Professor Saltzman, who had this mind swap machine, and that enabled you to put number 6's mind into the body of another actor who was called Nigel Stock. He was the other actor. So Nigel Stock in Do Not Forsake Me is playing the part of number 6 most of the time. And that was sort of designed by Vincent Tilsley to get over this business that McGoohan wasn't around to play the role.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that's the only episode I believe where number 6 kisses a woman, and it's the other actor.
Well, yes, he doesn't like kissing at all much. I mean, I think he's quite close to Janet. Of course, his fiancée
Yeah,
in that episode is called Janet, and she's the daughter of Sir Charles Portland, who is one of number 6's bosses in London. You know, Sir Charles Portland's daughter seems to be number 6's fiancée in Do Not Forsake Me. So obviously he gets close to her. But of course, really, it's not really McGoohan getting close to her in that episode. It's actually Nigel Stock
yeah.
getting close to her and dancing with her at one point in Do Not Forsake Me. It's Nigel Stock who gets to be with the fiancée rather than Patrick McGoohan.
Well, so let me ask both of you then. Let's talk about like the flow, sort of the flow of the episodes. Here we have the fellow. He's brought in an arrival. We find out about Rover, this weather balloon. That's well, a weather balloon is the prop, but we don't know what in the diegetic reality of the show what it is. Is it a gelatinous goo or whatnot that is sort of the border patrol that doesn't let people leave this village? Then we have a few episodes where he's getting used to being in the village. Then he seems to be in the midway through the series. He's sort of an old timer now. It seems that the show is set over maybe about a year and a half period, something like that. And then we see he gets a lot more cynical and he gets a lot more devious. There are a few episodes where he quote unquote wins against the power structure of the village and the various number 2s. And then we sort of get sort of the more surreal episodes, and then the end. So let's talk a little bit, both of you, your opinions on what that might have meant symbolically, or in a Freudian sense, perhaps. Or I know, Dave, you wanted to talk about that.
Okay, right. Yeah, McGoohan said that Arrival was the finest pilot that he'd ever read when he read the script.
Yeah.
And what Arrival does is try to condense into the allotted viewing time as much information as possible to hook the viewer into watching what comes next, and also to introduce all the various elements. You're pretty right in general in the way that it flows. What I find so intriguing is that I interviewed a number of the writers, and they all virtually said to a man, we were given a blank sheet of paper to do what we wanted. The amount of freedom that we had, I've never had before, said one. So one of them, for example, there's an episode called The General. It's about a device called Speed Learn, where you learn a 3-year history course in 3 minutes.
One of those famous 1960s, 70s room-sized computers that has about 1/10,000th the computing power of computers on our desk.
And the writer said that he'd become very concerned at the way education was being taught, that it was a system of rote. People were not being asked to think, they were just being filled up with facts. The clever thing about The Prisoner is that it operates on different levels. You've got the surface level of the adventures of number 6, and he tries to escape. But expertly buried beneath that, there's all these other elements going on. There's social comment, there's fantasy, there's drama, there's all sorts of things. Surrealism, it is all there. And while the pilot was being written, McGoohan was away writing a biting satire on the nature of democracy called Free for All, that was actually made at the same time as Arrival, but screened forth. And he wrote it under a pen name of Paddy Fitz. Paddy, with the Irish connection,
Yeah.
Fitz, because his mother's maiden name perhaps was Fitzpatrick. And it is full of such clever words, like humour is the very essence of a democratic society. Everything you think here is in the strictest confidence. You know, this is really good stuff. And Anthony Skene, who wrote 3 episodes, and they form a kind of mini series in themselves. He wrote A, B, and C, which is about dream manipulation and drugs. He wrote Dance of the Dead, which is perhaps the most enigmatic of all of the series, very surreal. And that was the first one he wrote. He walked out the script conference and he said, I had a headache. I didn't know what I was going to do. And he went home and said, if in doubt, I do something on a trial. And he actually told me that it was partly based on a film called The Devil and Daniel Webster that you may be familiar with,
Yeah.
starring John Huston, and various very strange radio messages that the British government put out in the Second World War, that the spies in France would know that it meant something, and they would kind of take it up from there. He got the idea of A, B, and C. He was which is the first one I mentioned, when he was asked to do something using a lot of back projection. And he thought, I've got to do something better than that. And he walked over the back lot at the studios, and they'd just finished filming there. What was that?
Was it The Dirty Dozen?
The Dirty Dozen, yeah. And he thought, hang on, I can do something with this. It's a French street, and he orchestrated it from there. So you've got all these themes that were able to be put into it and interjected. I'm not sure at this point, I'll pause for breath and hand over to Max, if I've actually answered your question, Dan, but I'll let Max have a go.
Yes, just tell me the question again.
Well, I probably forgotten it as well, but let's talk about the number twos, because that's one of the most intriguing aspects of the show. Is that there is supposedly the big bad number one that we never see until possibly at the end, and we'll get. That's another thing that people debate. But the number twos are very interesting in that there's this rotating cast of characters that seem to be in charge of the village. Sometimes they seem to be absolute dictators. Some of them seem to be borderline psychotic. Others seem to be more democratic. In one episode, one number two tries to kill another number two, supposedly. We have one number two, Leo McGoohan's character, who appears in 3 episodes. There's another one that appears in 2 episodes. So let's talk about the number two, the actors, and what number two represents.
Yeah, well, basically, number two is the chairman of the village, the person who's in charge sort of day to day of the village. And of course, he's answerable to number one, who is only on the end of the telephone. You know, you sort of see number two on the telephone to number one in several episodes. But basically, number two is the sort of administrator, the chairman and chief administrator of the village, who's in charge of day-to-day activities. And of course, in the first episode, Arrival, you have 2 number two characters in 1 episode. And normally it's a different number two every week. Although, of course, in the case, as you mentioned, Leo McGoohan, he comes back. He's number two in charge of Big Ben, and he's number two again in Once Upon a Time, and then he's also in the final episode Fallout. And of course, you've also got Colin Gordon. Colin Gordon is number two in A, B, and C.
Yeah.
He's also number two in The General that they mentioned earlier about the computer. And you've got people like Kenneth Griffith, who was number two in The Girl Who Was Death.
Yeah.
And later on, he turns up again in Fallout as the president. You've also got Patrick Cargill, who is a character called Thorpe in Many Happy Returns, and he pops up a few weeks later as number two in Hammer into Anvil.
Yeah.
So you've got lots of different people. But basically, number two it's a very precarious job, the job of number two, because you're going to be replaced very quickly. And if you mess it up, like, for example, in Hammer into Anvil, when number two, is defeated by number 6, you're immediately replaced. But it seems that with some number two characters, they've done reasonably well, apparently, so they're able to come back again. But what I think was the reason for all these changes every week, or virtually every week, was that it enabled you to have lots of different famous actors and actresses as your guest stars. You see, you have lots of different actors and actresses, which enable you to have a variety of very well-known guest stars in your 17 episodes. Yeah,
that's true. And one other little facet that I'll put in is the idea. They published these 2 guides to the prisoner, ITC did, because after the series ended, people were asking so many questions what it was all about. So ITC decided they better put something together to send to people. And this is what they did. And it says in here that the idea of alternating number twos is so that number 6 can never be comfortable, because after all, if you're with someone for a period of time, you get to know them and their weaknesses.
Yeah.
But if they're always dealing with someone new, someone different, then you're always going to be taken by surprise and react. And it's very, very difficult coping with that.
Well, but it's interesting too because I don't know if the term was coined back in the '60s, the Stockholm syndrome, where someone who's kidnapped
Oh,
sympathizes with their captor. You would think at some point, though, they would have found a number two that sort of grooved a little bit better with number six, and maybe have kept him there longer so that number six might, because there are a few episodes where you see number two's trying to befriend number six and
yeah.
and trying to use that kind of psychology. Um, which what do you think if you had to pick, say, I aside from say the first episode and the last two episodes, the 14 episodes in between, because the first and the last one are, you really can't, they're sort of immutable. They everything else in between. Which do you think are the best episodes and why? Say if you pick two or three.
Okay. For me, the most intriguing episode of all is Dance of the Dead.
Yeah,
Um, the
Mary
reason,
Morris as number two, right?
yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of things going for it. First of all the major parts in it really are played by women.
Yeah,
It's it is located in the village. There's a lot of village footage, so you spend a lot of time there, and there's that intriguing scene on the beach. I mean, the whole program's about dreams and surrealism, and is he really alive? You know, the beach scene with the sun going down with Mary Morris dressed as Peter Pan. You know, she says, "What are you looking for?" And he says, "Well, I'm looking for my world." And they have this verbal battle, and you're always wondering what is going on. And he goes to a fancy dress carnival and he gets his own suit.
hmm
And he says, when asked, why he's got his own suit, it means I'm still myself. Now that's a good throwaway line. And because he wears his own suit, maybe the village are trying to kill his identity. So you come in the end to a trial where he is put on trial for possessing illegally a radio. And there's the words, the wordsmithing is very, very intelligent indeed. There's three judges, just like they had in the French Revolution.
hmm
And it said, well, they got through the dead wood, didn't they? And then he's chased through this series of labyrinthine corridors, described in the script as being like a German expressionist film. Now, who would go to that level of detail in describing something in a script? Only someone that was really dedicated to it. And it ends up in this room where there's a telex machine that he destroys, but it goes on working. And you're left with the whole image that you're wondering what you've watched. What does it mean?
Yeah.
And it's an episode that repays repeat viewing. It is so rich, you go back time and time again.
Yeah, and
So,
Dave, I just want to tell you, uh, it's called Dance of the Dead, and you mentioned
yeah,
about whether or not he's alive or not. And I don't know if you're a connoisseur of sort of B horror sci-fi films, but in 1962 in America, there was a director of industrial films named Herc Harvey who did a black and white film called Carnival of Souls, and basically it's about this woman who falls in a car wreck off a bridge, and we throughout the whole film she's haunted by this vision of this ghoul-like creature. In the end, she ends up in this desert carnival abandoned, and she's chased by ghouls, and the scenes of McGoohan being chased are so much like that. The only difference is the ghouls get the girl, and we find out later as they're pulling the car out of the river that the girl has been dead all along. With McGoohan, he actually escapes and has the showdown with Mary Morris at the end. So
yeah,
I don't know if McGoohan. It probably was just coincidental, but that always stuck in my mind. The sort of frenzied zombie-like villagers just
yeah,
running through
yeah.
these corridors
It
reminded me
is,
of that.
yeah, yeah, very, very much so. It is chilling the way he is chased. You can see the mob, the bloodlust,
Yeah.
and I mean that's very, very powerful. For my second choice, I'd probably go to the political satire that McGoohan wrote, Free for All.
Uh-huh.
Because again, and the cutting is so quick, and the colours are so rich, the wording. It is very, very powerful, and it's saying important things. It's saying to the audience, don't just watch this. It's saying, question it.
Right,
Perhaps,
the newspeak of the reporters when he says no comment
yeah,
and then no comment and then
yeah,
he says something. He said no comment.
yeah. It is just brilliant. Now, remember, this is an actor, and
Yeah,
he's able to come up with a script of this complexity. It is absolutely superb. And the third episode that I think I would choose would be Many Happy Returns,
yeah,
where he wakes up to a village that is deserted. There's nobody there. He builds a raft. He gets away. He gets back to London, and then he actually ends up in the village. And when he goes to his cottage, where there's still nobody around, as soon as he gets to his cottage, the whole village comes back into life.
yeah,
And you think, what's all that about?
yeah.
Really, really clever. What are your choices, Matt?
Well, yes, I mean, I certainly like Dance of the Dead. It seems with the number two characters, some of them have a slightly different agenda. Now, Mary Morris in Dance of the Dead, she says this man has a future with us. You see, Mary Morris,
Yeah.
it seems, wants number six to actually go over to the side of the village, to help the village, to work with the village. She wants him to stay in the village and to work with them.
And in
But with
fact,
other number two characters, it seems they just want to know why he resigned. I
right.
mean, with several episodes, it's, well, tell me why you resigned. That's what it's all about.
And in fact, in fact, in the last episode, the president in his speech says, lead us, show us, we'll follow
Lead us
you.
go.
And do you have any other episode, Max?
Yeah, well, Checkmate, I like the human chess game.
Yeah.
That's one of my favourites because, of course, you see a lot of Portmeirion, which I like anyway, and also it's about the business of people being pawns and being sort of moved around, by others, manipulated by others. So that's a good episode. So Dance of the Dead, Checkmate, and also I agree with Dave about Free for All. That's a very good political satire. I tend to like the ones that show more of Portmeirion. Obviously, I'm sort of in love with Portmeirion, if you like.
Yeah.
So if I see more of Portmeirion, I tend to prefer those episodes rather than the studio-based ones. I like to see a lot of the location filming.
I think that's right about Checkmate, because it's all about games. If you look at it, okay, you've got a human chess game, but there's other sorts of games going on. You see all the characters playing games with other people, and number six sets out to discover who's a village and who's a warder, and he managed to come up with a simple test that will tell him by asking a question what reaction he gets, whether it's a fellow prisoner or it is a warder. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in that episode as well.
Yeah, there's the episode that after having watched Danger Man struck me, and we'll talk a little bit about the Drake number six connection. That really, I think, I saw a lot of retrospectively because after I watched Danger Man, I watched The Prisoner again, and it's the episode, I forget the name of it, where
Once upon a time.
is that no, the one where there's the double and there's
Schizoid Man. Schizoid
right.
Man.
Yeah, the schizoid man, and he's about to get away, and he makes the one little slip up where number two asks him about because he's playing the guy who's impersonating him,
Yeah.
and he has and how is Susan, and meaning the other guy's wife, and he says, oh, she's fine, and then he comes down in the plane and says Susan died a year ago, and and there were a number of moments where he's just a millimeter away from beating them and getting away and really beating them, and his own fallibility, so that one, I don't think it's as strong as some of the episodes you made it overall, because there's always the evil twin kind of thing that sometimes comes into television series like that. But that ending was just like a needle that just lanced the boil.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's talk about we'll talk about a few other things, but in one of the breaks we had been talking about the John Drake number six conundrum, and I agree with Max that in a critical sense, in a philosophic sense, it doesn't really matter. In a sense, it's minutia, because whether it's John Drake or whether it's Billy Drake, his twin brother, doesn't really matter. But it has garnered a lot of clips over the year, and there is the penultimate episode where number two is pretending he's a headmaster, and I'll see you in the morning, break or Drake, and I. Having what, and I know Dave, you said that you've got the script and it says break with a B, but I know when I slowed down the DVD, the difference between saying a D with the lips apart and a B where it's close, and I know my wife has super acute hearing. He seems to 99+% say Drake. Uh, what let me just put it this way, rather than argue over whether he is or not, do you agree that it's sort of immaterial, but if he is Drake or is not Drake, what do you think effect that has on the series and linking the two, you know?
Well, I like it, you see, because this is all part of the prisoner puzzle.
Yeah.
You know, what they were doing were they were making something that they wanted to be remembered, that would really stand out. And what better way than to alter a single word in a script?
Yeah.
And it's just gone. Now, by this time, you see, McGoohan was brought back for Once Upon a Time, and he and McGoohan got on extremely well. And McGoohan was again a man of some standing and principle. And I wouldn't put it past them because it's a two-hander. They have all these conversations, and I wouldn't put it past them saying, instead of saying Drake, say Drake, because everyone will then wonder.
Yeah.
It's another ambiguity.
Yeah.
And that's what's so appealing about it. You're still asking all these questions.
Yeah, it's a Franz Kafka like little twist there that
Yeah. Yeah.
it isn't necessary to know, but it does give it sort of a little twist. How about you, Max? What is your take on that?
Well, yeah, the actual line in Once Upon a Time is report to my study in the morning break. Now, in actual fact, it's the way he says it that convinces me it's break with a B, because he says it just really quickly, report to my study in the morning break. Now, you see, if he was saying report to my study in the morning, you'd expect a slight pause, a comma, a slight pause. Report to my study in the morning, Drake. You see, Drake.
Not necessarily.
But you see, he says it very quickly. Report to my study in the morning break. I mean, it's just a line that comes out like that. And that's how I feel about it. I'm convinced it's break.
Well, I'm not, you see,
Okay,
because for the reason that I've said, perhaps because they actually wanted to put a bit of a twist on it.
Yes.
To give a kind of two fingers to Ralph Smart.
Yes.
And to also make the audience question.
Yeah, I think Dave and I'll have to agree to disagree on that. I mean,
which is so great.
Which is great.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm convinced it's break with a B. But I'll give you just a very quick little story. People are often convinced by all sorts of strange things. I mean, we've talked earlier on about the episode "Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling," where you've got the fiancée Janet who goes to Number Six's house in London, and she meets the Number Six substitute, played by Nigel Stock. And about 20 years ago, when I was running the prisoner shop, somebody came into the shop and they said, "Oh, yes, apparently in Do Not Forsake Me, Number Six, his name is Carl." Said, "What on earth are you talking about? His name's Carl? What do you mean, Carl?" And this person said, "Oh, yes, well, Janet," she says, "it's Carl. Is he back? Is he with you?" You see, and in actual fact, what she says is his car.
Yeah.
She's been outside his London home. She sees his car. And so when Nigel Stock opens the door, she says, "His car. Is he back? Is he with you?" But this person I met said, "Oh, no, it's Carl. Is he back?" You see, so people have all sorts of interpretations. But as far as I'm concerned, she says, "His car. Is he back? Is he with you?"
Now, one of the episodes too that people sometimes used to point to, number six being Drake, is The Girl Who Was Death, which is one of the most surreal and wacky episodes, which turns out to be number six reading a children's book. And in that episode, well, from what I've read, that episode was originally going to be sort of like the Love Grove episode from Danger Man. It was originally a Danger Man episode that and it was recycled because Potter, the character Potter, who is in, I believe, Shindashima or it might have been Kuroshi, reappears. And the thing was, I think there was only, because of the two color episodes of Danger Man appearing in between that, there was only a couple of weeks difference between them airing. So What is the story of that odd little episode?
Okay, right. They were running out of ideas. They got to 13 and they were running out of ideas.
Yeah.
And they cast around and said, who's got ideas? And this scriptwriter, what's his name? Terence Feely. He had written Schizoid Man, and he was on holiday. And he said, well, I've got an idea. And it turned out to be this comedy. He was in the south of France. McGoohan went down to see him, and they wanted to get out of the village. They wanted to explore, take the prisoner beyond the village. They wanted to do something different, and it had become, very heavyweight. So McGoohan liked the idea of this, an escapist comedy, okay, and so Feely said, well, we can dress it up. It can be a storybook and all the rest of it. And it was actually planned to be 2 episodes. The length of it would run over 2 episodes. He would go into a maze for that hat to be cut, as did other things as well. So it was really set out as a bit of an escapist fantasy. And what better way than, in a sense, to reprise a spy character, perhaps John Drake, and take him through all of this. It showed me, it was lovely to see. I liked it very much because each week you sat down and you didn't know what you were going to get. This week it's going to be The Girl Who Was Deaf. Next week it's going to be a Western.
Yeah.
But it showed me that McGoohan could play comedy. And it's an episode I really, really enjoy. That's my take on it. What about you, Max?
Yeah, and of course, also in The Girl Who Was Deaf, at some point in the episode, number 6 is dressed as Sherlock Holmes. So he's trying to be a different type of agent or detective, in that episode as well. He's trying to be a Sherlock Holmes, a sort of consulting detective, as well as a sort of secret agent type person. Yeah, I find it an amusing episode, but as I mentioned to you earlier, you see hardly any of Portmeirion in it. So I wouldn't say it's one of my favorites because, as I mentioned earlier, I like to see the ones with a lot of Portmeirion.
I like it very much.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap up this segment with a final point and question, and then we'll go on with a few smaller segments about the later career of Patrick McGoohan. You had mentioned earlier the episode The General, and to me, that's a good episode, and one of my favorite parts of that is the end where he sort of fizzles out the computer just by typing the question to be answered, WHY. And I think now, years later, and I've always been big on science, and people want to know about the origin of the cosmos, and do the turtles go all the way down? Are we a holograph or whatnot? Is there a God, and who made God? That kind of question. And it's like, there is no ultimate, that, in a sense, those 3 letters are the ultimate question. Why? And that's something you can't answer, and that gets to the heart of the philosophical depth of the show. And would you guys agree on that?
Yes, I emphatically would. It just amazes me. People don't ask themselves the big questions at all. Do you remember a book called Sophie's World? It was all about philosophy that was made popular. And it's described like this. The magician, he has a hat and he pulls the rabbit out the hat. What does the rabbit do? The first thing it does, it looks for food. It wants lettuce. How often do you pull a rabbit out and the rabbit says, that was a clever trick, how's it done? And that's just like us, the human race. Many people go through lives and they never really ask the big questions. The big questions are what it's all about. Who are we? Why are we here? Why? You just have to keep on asking this and go beyond and be beyond. This is what makes life so interesting. The philosophical arguments. What I like so much about The Prisoner is it sets out its stall, and we have endless debates about it.
Yeah.
And we all agree to differ.
Yeah.
We each have our own interpretation because the way each of us sees life, we all see life differently. So why? I'm with you 100%. Max.
Yeah, and also, of course, with The General, it reminds me a bit of George Orwell 1984 because Number two at one point says, "Oh, we should be making our own knowledge. We should be sort of providing the knowledge for the villagers. So that they'll be knowledgeable cabbages." So it's a bit like 1984 in that you sort of manufacture knowledge, you make things the way you want them to be. So that's quite intriguing about the general. That basically the village can make up its own knowledge, which it will then feed to the villagers. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to wrap this section with the final sort of controversy, and I'm not a believer in spoilers because if a work of art can is spoiled by knowing a certain fact about this or that. It's not really a work of art. It's just a lowest common denominator. So let's talk about just the final episode. And in the final episode, basically, which is a continuation of the penultimate episode, we find that number one has defeated number two. He's led into a room where a Beatles song is playing. He's told that he's basically the messiah of the village. What happens is the Alexis Canner character, or Alexis Canner, who was in an early episode, the Western episode, comes back as a different character. We get this sort of critique of society, and then he gets to meet number one. At one point, it seems that number one is sort of a hydrogen bomb or something. That's the way it seemed, and it reminds me of the ending of the sequel to the movie Planet of the Apes back, I think in '68 or '69 that came out a year or two later. But he goes in, he meets this figure that seems to be number one. There's a gorilla mask or a monkey mask. He pulls it off, and it seems to be his own reflection. Everything sort of goes crazy. They leave the village. They're back in London, and then we sort of get the ending, which is the beginning of the show, where we see him, the opening of the show, where he's zooming down in his little sports car, and it makes one wonder: was all of this in his head? Was this again a Kafka-esque moment that And it makes number six sort of like Joseph K. From the trial. What is your take on that? Do you think that there was really a village, that this was a place, that this was the East versus the West, or was this? Because for me, having watched Danger Man 2, this is another thing that I think psychologically works with Danger Man, is that if this was John Drake and he has just recently gone through the Shindashima stuff and whatnot, it's a wonderful way to think that his mind has concocted all this stuff. He wants to rebel against his supervisors, and something that he recently did in the Shindashima, his mind is sort of reconfigured. Again, it doesn't really matter, but what is your take? Do you think that it's all in his head?
Fallout, the majesty of Fallout. It is such a fitting end to this enigmatic series that McGoohan described as being an allegorical conundrum. Someone else once said it's a blend of Kafka, John Fowles, who wrote The Magus, and the outlook of Carl Jung. Well, this sets the seal and makes this enigmatic series forever memorable. Fallout is ambitious, confused, surreal, defies audience expectations, it throws down a gauntlet, it challenges the audience, and you get to the end and you're left thinking, what's it all about? And you're left thinking, is it in his head? Well, there's various stories on this, and one of them is that they set out to make The Prisoner and they didn't have an ending in sight. And Lou Grade said, you've got to wrap it up, Patrick. And McGoohan had to go away and write the final episode. He says he wrote all three of his episodes, Free for All, Once Upon a Time, and Fallout, in approximately 36 hours each. And certainly time was getting very, very tight when they got to Fallout. Viewing dates were looming ever larger. And I think that McGoohan set out to make the final episode as surreal and as memorable as possible, with as many twists and turns. He wanted the audience to sit there at the end and say, what on earth was all that about? And to use their grey matter. There's good arguments that it is entirely cyclic, that the last shot is the first shot, and that the whole thing's happening in his head as he's driving down the runway. I I did something called a brain bash in 1996, where I got about 50 members of our society come along for a full day, and I went through a kind of graduated journey into the prisoner. And I wrote it up as a 20,000 word booklet afterwards called The Long and Winding Road. And the titles of some of the episodes that I covered in it are, first of all, Why the Prisoner is a Work of Art. Then I went on to the sources, origins, and inspiration. And you've got to go back to the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, German expressionist cinema, for that. The social comments. And I went on looking at different elements, and I entitled one bit From Kafka to Kierkegaard, From Christianity to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, because someone maintained that the last episode got a lot of Christian symbolism in it, and there are three men who are being put on trial, just as Jesus Christ and the two criminals were. And then someone said, well, actually, it's taken from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's the state of Bardo is halfway between here and the afterlife. The Majesty of Fallout. Well, what happened was that McGoohan got those close confidence around him. He summoned back McGoohan because he knew he could rely on him. He saw Alexis as being a son. I met Alexis, I knew him well, and he just thought the world of Patrick. And also, he got Kenneth Williams, Kenneth Griffith,
Right.
Yeah. who he knew was a man of integrity, and they built this final episode. And it's deliberately as perplexing as possible. There's never been anything like it before, never been anything like it since. It was McGoohan's final gesture to the world of, there you are, make of it what you will. He said in subsequent interviews, everything from, it's just the end of a job, that's all. It's a load of old rubbish. The stories are all about one man's unflinching battle for survival. People disappear into camps like this. It's not fiction. It's as real as headlines. It's my yell back. And the viewer has the right to shout nuts to you, Paddy boy. So,
how about you, Max?
Well, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, Fallout is basically about people trying to escape, and you can't escape from yourself. I mean, basically, wherever you go in the world, you've always got your own mind with you. You've got your own experiences, your own memories, the things that have happened over the years. So people sometimes think that if they go to a different part of the world, they'll be able to sort of escape to a new life. But often that is not the case, because wherever you go in the world, you've always got your own mind with you. You can't escape from yourself. And I think that's what McGoohan was trying to state in Fallout, that wherever you go, you're always going to be a prisoner of yourself. And that's why at the end of Fallout, you see the word prisoner come up on the screen just as he's in London again. He's sort of credited as prisoner just before the series ends at the end of Fallout. And so he's still a prisoner at the end.
And his apartment is number 1 too. It's
number 1 Buckingham Place, and of course you notice the door opens automatically,
right?
Like it does in the...
and we should mention too, there was the butler played by the dwarf actor. He's
Angelo Muscat.
He's the only guy who appears McGoohan does appear at the beginning and end of the one where he switches to Nigel Stark. So I guess Muscat is the only other one who appears in all of the episodes.
Angelo Muscat the butler, he's in almost all. Yeah, I think there are 1 or 2 that he doesn't appear, but he's in almost all of the episodes from start to finish. And yeah, he's a very important character actually, because of course throughout the series he seems to be serving number 2. He seems to be working for the village.
Right.
But in the final episode, Fallout, he seems to switch his allegiance from the village to number 6, and he escapes to London with number 6. He seems to be serving number 6, the prisoner, at the end.
And you have to ask the question, does he do this because number 6 has emerged triumphant and is the new power?
Yeah.
Or does he do it because deep within himself he's fed up with serving and he wants to escape and be free? But what Max says is right. You know, McGoohan said, what's the worst thing on this planet? it's the evil aspect of ourselves. We've all got two sides to us, the nice side, and in each of us dwells this other nasty side.
And there's also the legendary sort of fallout from Fallout. Was McGoohan, were there people really angry over the episode?
Yes, yes. The telephone switchboard was jammed. It was just jammed with viewers ringing up and complaining. And the following weeks in the TV listings magazines, there were people writing in to complain. And in the papers, the TV reviews were saying, what on earth's all this all about? Because it was ahead of its time, you see. Um, I remember that Alexis used to say it was like instead of working with putty, you were painting the Sistine Chapel. And for every kind of 10 or 12 outraged viewers, there was one who went, wow, that's really something. But of course, when something's ahead of its time, it takes a while for people to catch up.
Yeah.
McGoohan actually had to go in hiding. People went round knocking on his house,
Yeah.
knocking on his door. So he and his family had to escape and go into hiding.
Well,
Yeah.
you mentioned the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and it made me think of another German expressionist film. At the end of the penultimate episode, the Leo McKern #2 dies, and then he's sort of resurrected, and something is put on his face, and it reminded me of the Golem, where the dead is
Yes,
resurrected with
yes,
an amulet, and I
yes.
didn't think of that until you mentioned Caligari, and it's one of those things that shows the depth of the prison is that I first saw the show on public television here in New York in '76 or '77, a decade after it aired. Then I got the DVD in '02. I've watched it 4 or 5 times, most recently a couple of months ago, and yet still you make a comment like that and I say, there's something else. So that tells you that it's a work of art, because I
Yeah.
could watch it another 10 times and
Oh, yes.
there'll be one or two little things in each episode that you go, oh, I never noticed the way that character looks, or oh, look at that, the way that's something in the background, and you know.
And remember, it was filmed in 35mm and in colour. And at the time, in Britain, we only had black and white.
Yeah.
You couldn't see colour.
Yeah.
So there was a lot that we missed on our small screens. Incidentally, I think the Golem was a passion of the actor Paul Wegener.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, he again, well, different thing, but an interesting character.
And on that same vein, Max had mentioned about going back to the John Drake thing, is they didn't foresee DVDs where you could stop and see the way someone's lips move. So I just had to get that final thing in. But
Yeah.
let's move on to McGoohan's later career in our next segment. We'll
Okay.
end this segment and we'll talk about things such as his television appearances in America, Columbo, Murder She Wrote. He had a third series called Rafferty. I don't know if you guys ever seen that, but we'll talk about that in a minute when we get back.